Chapter 8, Time to be Careful. Day 7. It didn't take long for the boys of the 6th year to realize that something was strange. Everyone had gone to bed feeling a little too tired to take note of certain oddities, and frankly in the dark it hadn't been noticeable. But in the morning light it was all too apparent, and growing more annoying by the minute. Growing being the key word. What are we sleeping in a greenhouse? Sirius complained. His previous warm thoughts about their new dorm mate seemed to have vanished just as quickly as they had come. He glared at Tempest as if the boy had brought the plague to their door. And he very well might have. Harry shrugged desperately. Sorry about all this. He'd actually said this phrase a few times now. The young time traveler had been awoken this morning being jostled by Remus. It was an odd circumstance. During his time in the past Harry had, much to his pride, been the one boy that the prefect didn't have to forcibly remove from his bed every morning. Thus, he was a little shocked that he had required waking, and the faint light that was creeping through the curtains also led him to believe that it wasn't that late. What? He muttered, trying not to be grumpy. Really he was. Harry, I think your herbology assignment is a success. That was an odd thing to wake someone up for, Harry thought dazedly. He muttered articulately. Look, Remus stated. That would require him to open his eyes all the way right. Still, Harry somehow managed to comply with this unreasonable request, only to quickly shut his eyes again and groan. That bloody plant, he cursed. The boa vine that had entered his life yesterday was making its presence felt. The vivid green plant had spread from the canopy of his bed, across the walls, and seemed to have twined around everyone else's beds and personal effects before growing thick on the floor. Their dormitory looked as if it was somewhere in the jungle. Like to grow, came a hissing sound that seemed far too loud. Harry ignored it. Don't think of snakes, don't think of snakes, he repeated to himself before speaking. Sorry about this, he said to Remus. Sitting up he looked around tiredly. How did you do it? Remus asked in amazement. I saw the plant Professor Pod gave you yesterday. I didn't even talk to it last night, Harry said in some amazement. What? Remus asked curiously. Nothing. What? Harry looked away and shrugged, his attitude going for nonchalant. Yeah, this is something, isn't it? He was soon ducking under his bed trying to find the small book that Professor Pod had given him. There had to be something in there on containing the wretched vine. Endangered plant, this thing grew like a weed. That led to their current situation, wherein Harry's dorm mates were trying almost helplessly to gather their belongings for the day. Such a normal task was somehow very difficult. The vine had managed to twine around dressers, tangle up backpacks, and, in Peter's case, it had even managed to imprison the boy in his bed. Okay, so it wasn't all bad. Harry paged through the black book helplessly. Once again he was finding nothing helpful. Who cared that the vine grew better in phosphate-rich soil? As far as Harry could tell, the thing didn't need soil at all. Are you sure this isn't a prank? James Potter asked for the second time. No, Harry repeated. James shook his head. Man, it is a good one. The Quidditch star seemed unable to accept that such a genius prank was in fact an accident. He'd been chuckling to himself for the last half hour, while wrestling his clothes from the plant. I think we should get Professor Pod, Remus stated again. What would he be able to do? He was trying to get the thing to grow, not kill it, Harry argued. Also he worried what the man would do if he saw their dorm's current state. For all he knew, the room might be considered a preserve for an endangered plant. I say we go jungle and just machete it, Sirius said, yanking at his own dresser drawers. Could you at least cut me out? Peter asked. At first he'd been a little upset and frightened, but that novelty was wearing off and Peter was contemplating going back to sleep. We're a half hour late for class, Remus moaned. James laughed. Just brilliant, he said. I don't think we could have come up with a better prank. It isn't a prank. Harry tried to argue again. It's just potions, was Sirius's attempt at easing Remus's panic. Potions, Remus said, his voice a little higher pitched than normal. Slughorn will never let us make up the points. Maybe not you, James agreed, but I think he sort of likes me and Sirius. Your families rather, Remus remarked sourly. Harry was wondering if he could whisper in Parseltongue. He was perhaps the most dressed of the four. Casually he kicked of one of his shoes and pushed it under the bed. I wonder where my shoe is, he said louder than was necessary. Everyone looked at him like he was dense. I'll, just look under my bed for it, shall I? He speculated. Harry quickly crawled under his bed, rather glad to miss the questioning looks he received. And why was it necessary for him to crawl so far under his bed? Well, thankfully everyone was too occupied with their own concerns to mind him. Harry managed to wiggle his way close to the wall and vine. "You're too big," he hissed with a slightly angry tone. "Like to grow?" the vine replied. "Yes, I know you like to grow. I don't care. You're too big, get smaller, stay by my bed. If you don't, I'll let Sirius take a machete to you." Harry's temper really wasn't where it should be. He was under his bed, whispering in Parseltongue to a plant, and to top it off he had to worry about his dead father figuring out he was a Parselmouth. The plant seemed to make a noise of unhappiness, but then with a sudden speed that surprised Harry, the vine seemed to collapse in on itself. It moved similarly to the way that a retractable measuring tape responds when it is released and allowed to retract. In other words, very fast. "Whoa," Remus called as one vine whipped past him at an amazing speed. "Ouch," Peter complained, rubbing his wrist where one vine had left a small red mark in its haste to move. In less than a minute the enormous vine had shrunk back to the size it had been the other night, growing harmlessly around Harry's bed, of which Harry was just crawling out from underneath of. "That was weird," he commented. "What did you do?" Remus asked, his tone slightly amazed. "Nothing," Harry was quick to say. "Maybe Sirius's machete talk frightened it." James frowned. "Yeah, maybe. Well, I suppose we can go to class now. There is no way that the professors will believe us," Remus moaned. Harry attempted a chuckle. Remus only glared at the attempt. Everyone knew that despite his rather impressive class record, Harry Tempest didn't give a hang about schoolwork. This seemed to particularly irritate the prefect at the moment. "I'm hungry," Peter stated. Harry nodded, for the first time agreeing with the rat. "Yeah, I think we should get some breakfast." "We should go to class," Remus argued. He was already packing his bag with books, a feat much easier now that the boa vine was no longer stealing his backpack. "If we all tell them together, the professors would have no choice but to believe us." "I didn't have dinner," Harry muttered. "Why weren't you at dinner?" Remus asked. Harry didn't bother to spare Sirius a glance. "I fell asleep," Harry said. He looked at his own backpack disdainfully. Somehow the idea of once again going to class and sitting through lessons he already knew just seemed unbearable. "I'm going to breakfast," he stated firmly. James swung an arm around his new dorm mate's shoulder. "First he pranks us, then he skives class. Ah, isn't it precious?" "Okay, that was almost sounding paternal." Harry quickly pushed James away. "I didn't prank you," he stated, for what must have been the 10th time. James shook his head, pretending to wipe a tear from his eye, and he denies it splendidly, a real professional. Harry decided there was no avoiding it. "Let's get breakfast," Sirius decided. He'd finally managed to get into his dresser, and now that he'd shed his pajamas he seemed ready for the day. And for the canine animagus, no day started without a healthy breakfast. Or two. Remus heaved a sigh. "All right," he relented, "but the Great Hall won't have any food. We'll have to show Harry the kitchens," Peter said. Harry didn't really like that Pettigrew seemed comfortable calling him by his first name. While it was easy to distance yourself from some things, knowing that Peter was a pathetic, betraying, foot-kisser, Voldemort's feet to be precise, well, it did make befriending him a little difficult. "Great," James said. "I like eating in the kitchen better." Sirius snickered. "You only like it because the house elves show proper appreciation for your greatness, or something like that." "What was it again?" James cringed. "I only said that once," he muttered. The 5 Gryffindor boys were soon leaving the dorm room, although James paused for a moment and grabbed something out of his trunk before being the last one out. They crossed through a mostly empty common room. Most of the students were in class. Only a few 7th years seemed to have schedules that allowed them time off in the mornings. When they exited for a moment, James once again dropped back, glancing at a piece of parchment. One which was oddly familiar. Harry felt as if a lead weight had landed squarely in his intestinal tract. The bloody map. How could he have forgotten that? The map never lies. Yeah, well, maps are nice like that. Time-traveling suns, however, well, they tell a few fibs. What you got there?" Harry asked with the feeling of dread descending upon him. "It's a map of Hogwarts," James answered. Sirius moved between Harry and the map, "and it's not something we want people knowing about." When had Sirius decided to be a Burke again? "Okay," Harry allowed. Still he couldn't help but wish he could manage to catch a glimpse of it. From what Remus had said once, the map had taken all their years of Hogwarts to make. It originally had just been a map to help them remember where all the secret passageways were, and the different passwords for each. Later they had added different spells to track people and other security devices to prevent unwanted readers. Each year they had added new spells, until their creation had been taken by a suspicious Filch. But what incarnation was the map currently in? Let's take a sweep through the West Passage and that stairway behind that portrait of a violin-playing hag. James tucked the map back in his pocket without giving Harry a glance at the parchment. The others nodded and Harry fell into step behind them. By James's route they encountered no one, finally entering the kitchens with no one the wiser. Which was good because they had all reached the point where breakfast sounded more appealing than finishing a potions class. Entering the kitchen provoked a reaction from the small inhabitants. House elves had been moving swiftly around the kitchen, taking pots, bowls, dishes and silverware to a large sink, whose bubbles were actually larger than the house elves themselves. But this didn't seem to be much of a problem considering the scrub brushes seemed to act on their own, and the dishes, once properly scrubbed, shot out of the sink at a fast speed and were caught by a few elves who then put them where they belonged. It really was quite an impressive way to wash dishes, and Harry was of the mind that perhaps the small creatures weren't as batty to like housework as he had always thought. This did seem like the funniest way to clean dishes that he had ever seen, and during his time at the Dursleys he'd cleaned his fair share. However, their presence wasn't unnoticed for long. Master's Marauders, one of the elves greeted. He seemed to a person of some importance seeing as a little copper pin was attached to the front of his pillowcase. Hey Mip, James greeted, obviously familiar with the little elf. You couldn't get us some breakfast? Peter asked. And just to prove Peter wrong, and show that, indeed, they could get breakfast, a flurry of little creatures were soon moving away from the sink and promptly bringing out a good collection of whatever had been served earlier today. The Marauders, plus Harry, soon settled themselves at a small round-shaped table. Small was perhaps the best way to describe it. The furniture was possibly used by the house elves themselves, and the chairs were so small that the wizards worried that they would break if sat on. Thus the group settled on the floor, eating their breakfast with some contentment. Harry was hungrier today than was common. Normally breakfast for him was an egg or some toast. But missing dinner had made him a little more ravenous. Remus tells me you have a werewolf friend, Sirius said. An odd way to start a conversation, Harry thought. Yes, he answered. James nudged his friend. And you're an orphan, huh? Sirius asked again. What was this, the Spanish Inquisition? Not to mention it seemed odd describing yourself as an orphan when your father was sitting beside you, eating his bowl of cereal rather sloppily. Yeah, he said. Who do you live with? Peter asked, seemingly wanting to join Sirius in whatever game he was playing. My aunt and uncle, Harry said stonily. Who do you live with? He added, mostly just to be disagreeable. My mum, Peter stuttered. For some reason the rat animagus didn't seem to like it when the tables were turned. Your parents were murdered, right? Sirius pressed on. Sirius, James said, once again nudging his friend and looking irritated. Just asking our new roommate some questions. Nothing wrong there, is it? Sirius raised a black eyebrow to James's frown. Harry's expression tightened some. I'm also a Leo, enjoy long walks on the beach and cuddling before an open fire, if any of that interests you, Harry offered snarkily. That seemed to shut Sirius up for a bit. James on the other hand found it funny and laughed. Remus's eyes were hiding laughter and Peter laughed, but only after James had. Soon the Marauders fell into their own conversations. Told old jokes, teased each other lightly. Harry was firmly reminded that he was very much the fifth wheel on the cart, but actually preferred it that way. Being in this time had the potential to be both bad and good. Personally he'd like to stick with remaining in the shadows. Let's at least go to Charms, Remus urged as everyone was finishing up their breakfast. I forgot my book, Peter said, sounding slightly panicky. Harry recalled that Charms was Pettigrew's best class. We've got enough time, Sirius said. See you in class, Tempus, he said. Harry nodded, not the least upset about the brash dismissal. Yeah, see you. Harry turned and left the Marauders alone. James faced Sirius with a somewhat perplexed expression. What was that about? I thought you were coming around to Tempus. Sirius sighed, exiting through the kitchen door as he spoke. Not everyone is willing to like the guy simply because he doesn't want to shag Evans. I don't know, Peter offered timidly. He seems nice enough. If a little weird. Sirius nodded. My point, don't you think he's strange? Mate, some people think we're strange, James offered. No, I mean really, he seems to be amazingly smart, gets every spell right on the first try. His herbology assignment, which is supposed to be close to going extinct, overtakes our room. not to mention the Acromantula and the Imperious Curse. And he defended Slytherins. James rolled his eyes. We get every spell right too. And he's amazing at Quidditch. Come on Moony, you think he's a little strange, right? Sirius, it seems, had decided to give up on convincing James. Moony paused, perhaps a little, he allowed, thinking of the boy's penchant for sweets, but I don't see why you felt the need to pry into his personal life. Sirius didn't know what to say to that. Honestly, he didn't know either. Perhaps it was because he wanted to kick the tires, so to speak. Maybe it was because there was something unsettling about Tempus, and it wasn't anything to do with the fact that the boy was good at schoolwork. It was just the way the boy responded to things. Sirius knew that during their confrontation the other night, if Sirius had been in Tempus's situation, he would have slugged himself. Or, that didn't come out right. If he were Tempus, he would have slugged Sirius. It was confusing to try and put himself in someone else's place. He didn't do it often. He simply couldn't get a firm grip on the boy's personality, and it was irritating him. The four had finally reached the common room. It was a little more crowded than it had been earlier. Students were moving from class to class. The third years must have some sort of presentation due as they emerged from their own dorm carrying boxes that seemed to smoke slightly. Entering the dorm, everyone looked around a moment, hoping that the dreadful vine hadn't once again overtaken their belongings, but the plant was growing harmlessly around Tempus's bed, looking as innocent as muggle ivy. Peter hurried to his trunk, digging through it until he found the charms book. "Ready, Pete?" Sirius asked. The other boy nodded. James also moved to his trunk. Pulling the map from his pocket, he placed it on top. "You don't think Tempus would tell anyone about the map?" he asked the others. Sirius looked concerned, but Remus shook his head in the negative. James shrugged. "You're probably right, but it seems odd to have someone in our dorm who isn't one of us," Sirius provided. "Someone new," James corrected. "When I pulled it out, I sort of forgot he was there." He suddenly looked toward Remus. "Is there defense after lunch today?" Remus nodded. "Double defense. Might as well grab that book. Hey, you know what curse we're doing today?" James added, some sort of excitement in his voice. Do you think Barton will really be able to lecture on for a whole class about the Avada Kedavra curse? I mean, it hits you, boom, you're dead. Not really that complicated." Sirius's words trailed off as the four teenagers left their dorm room. Behind him the air shimmered for a moment. The space seemed to fold in on itself as Harry Potter stepped out of his invisibility cloak. "If only it were that easy," Harry said, rubbing his lightning bolt scar in a distracted manner. He crossed to James's trunk and flipped open the lid. The piece of parchment lay on the very top, looking blank and not nearly as worn-looking as Harry remembered it to be. "I solemnly swear I am up to no good," Harry said. As usual, ink swept across the page, reveling the halls of Hogwarts. Harry quickly located the Gryffindor boys' dormitory, and there, right where he stood, was a little ink dot marked Harry Potter. It seemed somewhat strange seeing that name now. "Mischief managed," Harry directed. He moved to his father's trunk. He pushed aside some of the clothes and books that were on top, finally finding a second-year Transfiguration text. He shoved the map inside, before once again burying the book. He hoped everything looked unchanged, but then James's trunk was such a mess, Harry doubted that his father would remember how everything had been. Harry was certain that James would find the map again, just some time after he had returned to the future. It wouldn't do for James to learn the last name of his twin. Harry grabbed his own defense text, frowning as he did so. He wasn't looking forward to another of Barton's lessons on the unforgivables. Moody had spent only 2 days on the curses. That had seemed more than enough. Was it odd that a disguised Death Eater was Harry's preferred professor? Harry hurried through the common room, moving to the charm corridor. By the now silent halls it was easy to tell that class had already started. But Harry wasn't really worried. He had an excuse ready-made. He slipped into the charms room, trying to quietly pass Professor Flitwick, who was lecturing on the potential risks in some charm or other. Lily managed to send him a glance that was both disapproving and concerned. The marauders just looked at him dumbly. He could guess that they had been curious about why he wasn't already in class. He managed to snag a desk in front that no one had claimed. It didn't take long for him to fall into a stupor. He remembered why he didn't want to come to class. Flitwick was covering animation charms, something that Harry had already learned. Really, he wasn't smart. This sort of deception was proving annoying. He'd simply been taught this material only a month ago. Once the class had broken up to practice the spells, Flitwick approached Harry's desk. "Mr. Tempest, can you explain why you were late for class?" The small man inquired with a pleasant tone. "I'm afraid I got lost, sir," Harry answered, throwing on his best sheepish smile. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," the small man said kindly. "Perhaps you should stick with your fellow Gryffindors more." Harry nodded. The small professor nodding, before moving on to the other students. "Did you really get lost?" Remus asked. The bookish Gryffindor was seated behind him. He leaned forward questioningly. "Yeah, I'd ever been to the kitchens before, must have took a wrong turn," Harry lied. Remus seemed to pause for a moment before looking back at his text. Needless to say, Charms was rather boring. For whatever reason Lily seemed mad at him, and while the class practiced the charm Harry grew more and more bored. Finally he animated his quill to dance in Lily's direction. She seemed less than amused. Whether that was because she was mad or because her own quill seemed stuck doing a can-can, well, it could be either. Harry finally dismissed it. At least he had defense to look forward to. And that "my good friends" is sarcasm. When Charms was over, lunch was perhaps a welcome relief. Despite the fact that the male Gryffindor 6th years had just eaten breakfast not long ago, they all seemed able to eat a full meal. Lily was still ignoring him, which led Harry to spend most of the time chatting with Alice, who, he decided, he liked. Mostly because she had a sharp sense of humor and seemed to revel in making lewd comments about the professors' sex lives. "I'm just saying," the blonde said with a high tone, "it is a little suspicious that Professor Pod and Professor Slughorn both went to Egypt over the summer, and I have seen them chatting quite often." Frank looked down at his full plate. "Thanks, now I can't eat." Alice smiled. "What, there is nothing wrong with two men sharing in a healthy—" "Please stop," Frank implored. "I don't want to have to imagine Slughorn with anyone. Him naked would be like watching Jello jiggle, eh?" Alice commented. Harry looked down at the green Jello he had put on his plate. He tapped it speculatively with his fork and watched it shake. He looked at Frank. The feeling of companionship was overwhelming. He pushed his own plate away. "You two are so judgmental. Everyone needs a little good healthy sex," Alice decided. Ethan, who had been listening into the conversation, smiled at Alice. Draping his arm around her, he turned to Frank. "Man, you have the best girlfriend." Frank glared and Ethan removed his arm. Lily had been growing beet red as she tried to ignore the conversation. Harry was starting to see why Alice had traveled down this line of discussion. It was obviously grating for Lily to not step in and defend her professor's virtue. Alice seemed to note that he'd caught on to her agenda. "What about McGonagall?" she questioned. Lily stilled. Harry smiled, then tried to look serious. "Oh, I know she's shagging Professor Barton, that's obvious." Lily seemed to draw a large breath. "Well, but the real question is, do you think she's boinking Dumbledore too?" "You two stop this instant," Lily said, finally not being able to take any more. "They are professors, and they are professors." She seemed too flustered to offer any more defense. "I exist," Harry said in an amazed tone. "Alice, I officially exist." "That's good. I thought your non-existence was taking up a great deal of space," she commented. "Ha, ha, ha," Lily said without amusement. "You know perfectly well why I'm mad at you." Harry took a moment to think. "No, I really don't. You skived off a class." She hissed at him. "What are you, his mother?" Ethan complained. Frank nodded slightly. Lily didn't spare the 7th year a glance. Harry narrowly avoided choking. "Did you even ask me why I missed potions?" Harry asked. Lily opened her mouth, then paused. No, not exactly." Alice raised an eyebrow superiorly. Harry was starting to think that the two girls had already discussed this and Alice was being proved right. Lily caught the expression and seemed to mellow. She released a sigh and took a sip of her juice. "You remember the boa vine I got yesterday?" Harry asked. "Sure," Lily agreed, not knowing where this was going. Ethan and Frank were also tuning in, the older boys wondering what sort of excuse Harry would muster to appease the temperamental redhead. While quite a few men had tried to court the pretty Lily, James being the most determined, none had been able to withstand her temper. "Well, it seems that it isn't as difficult to grow as Professor Pod seems to think. The plant took over our dorm room." Sirius was almost forced to machete Pettigrew out of his bed. Lily looked suspicious. She looked down the table. "Remus, did Harry's herbology project take over your dorm room?" James took the opportunity to answer. "Sure did. It was the best prank I've seen in a fair while, not since Sirius flooded the James was forced to trail off when Sirius coughed meaningfully, his stare hard and demanding. It wasn't a prank, Harry argued once again. I'm telling you, the plant has a mind of its own. James shook his head proudly, and so sincere in his denial. Lily, however, had nodded softly. I suppose that would make getting to class difficult, she allowed. Everyone seemed to stare at her calm acceptance and Lily blinked in a confused manner. Finally she tugged on Alice's arm. I forgot my defense text, she stated. Alice shrugged, rising to her feet as well. I'll accompany you then, I suppose. The blonde snagged a cookie from the table before following after the fast clip that Lily was setting. Ethan and Frank descended upon Harry while the boy was deciding between tarts. The food verity anyway. That was quite amazing, Ethan said with an exaggerated tone of awe. What was? Harry asked. He looked up at the two seventh years. The older boys turned to each other and seemed to exchange some sort of silent conversation. They seemed to reach a decision and Frank leaned in to speak. About Lily, are you going to ask her to Hogsmeade? She's never listened to any guy like she listens to you. Neville's dad spoke quite seriously. Harry stopped chewing his lunch. What? He managed to say, a little bit of food clogging his speech. Lily, are you? No, Harry said with a vehemence that caused the other boys to lean back. Why was Neville's dad forcing Lily on him? The redhead couldn't be taking too much of Alice's time. Frank and she certainly seemed to have plenty of opportunities to sneak off. It was Ethan who answered, what, she's quite the dish. And I've tried to make the time of day with her, but she's a prickly flower if ever there was one. Ethan continued on but paused when he noticed Harry turning slightly green. You're not a puffer, you? Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. Not that there is anything wrong with that, Frank offered hesitantly. Harry coughed. That would make things easy, wouldn't it? But then things were never easy for Harry Potter. And, his masculine pride couldn't quite cope with that lie tossed on the pile. No, Harry answered. Still he couldn't avoid a little chuckle about how much easier it would be to be gay, in this situation at least. I simply don't like redheads, Harry answered. Both boys seemed a little confused by this idea. What's not to like? Ethan asked. Like? Not fat redheads. A few seventh girls from down the table seemed to have overheard and glared at Ethan in a dark way. Frank seemed to laugh. Now you're never going to lose your virginity before graduation. Ixnay on the Iginve talk, eh? Harry ignored them, and I didn't do anything to impress Lily. I only told her the truth. Ethan grew reflective. The truth. You can't tell girls the truth. They never react well to that, he said. He rubbed his cheek as if remembering a past experience with a girl and the truth. That is why you only tell them the truth that they want to hear, Harry related, taking on a posture reminiscent of Dumbledore. He crossed his fingers wisely and nodded his head, just before taking a bite out of one of the many cookies gathered on his plate. Ooh, Ethan said, nodding. I get it. That's smart. Harry continued looking wise, trying not to laugh. Frank, however, raised his eyebrow questioningly. It's like the blind leading the dumb, he decided, gazing at Harry and Ethan wearily. What is your type? Ethan asked, ignoring Frank. Blondes, Harry answered with a serious nod. Alice is. Don't think of Neville in a dress. Don't think of Neville in a dress. She's smoking hot. Yeah, and she's friendly, Ethan added with a little wink in Frank's direction. Dozy wanker, Frank cursed, threatening to whop Ethan upside the head. The other seventh year shied away. Hey, you heard her, and I am only proud in your choice of women. Ethan slung a friendly arm around his friend's shoulder. Harry laughed at the expression on Frank's face, one of long-suffering annoyance. Mr. Tempest, a moment if you please, said a voice from above. Harry looked up. Professor Dumbledore, Harry greeted. Good afternoon, I was wondering if I might have a little of your time before class. The headmaster asked. Throw in some lemon drops and you have a deal, Harry offered. The old man smiled. Indeed, I may have a few. Harry rose to his feet, trailing after Dumbledore. See you later, Harry called. Very important matters to discuss. The two wizards were seen walking together, exiting into the corridors. Some of those still present began to speculate as to what reasons the transfer might have for speaking with the headmaster. They ranged from the sensible, perhaps some of his grades didn't transfer, to the outlandish, you don't suppose he's Dumbledore's grandson, do you? For Sirius Black, who was still seated at the Gryffindor table, he merely continued eating, watching the pair leave with a thoughtful expression. Any trouble, Professor? Harry found himself saying. The man dug into his pockets, removing a small brown paper bag. No, Nothing to worry about, he offered the bag. Lemon drop. Harry nodded, taking one of the sweets. The pair continued to walk in silence for a moment. The students they passed looked at Dumbledore with some interest. Their headmaster, while never missing a meal, wasn't a common fixture among the halls. Everyone knew that their famous headmaster served many roles to the wizarding world, and that the heads of house did most of the daily management of the school. I did need to get your hair, remember, and as your time here in the past is reaching a week in length, I thought it best to speak with you before you vanish into nothing. Harry nodded. Wouldn't my hair vanish as well? He asked curiously. Not once it is removed from your body. As that is the case, it might be best if you began carrying any items you want to return with you on your person. Harry nodded. He'd already been thinking this himself. Reaching upward, he grabbed a bit of his hair and tugged. A few black strands pulled free and he held them out to the headmaster. Professor, I hope you don't think me overly paranoid. But what would be your ideal Christmas gift? Dumbledore looked a little surprised at the question. Well, I suppose socks, my boy. Can never have enough, although people seem to want to give me books. Were you wondering what to get me for Christmas? Harry looked a little sheepish. Just checking, he answered, handing over the hairs without fear. Dumbledore seemed to grasp Harry's thoughts. Yes, indeed. Best to be careful. Constant vigilance, Harry added with a faint grin. Dumbledore nodded in a fond way. And now I believe you had best be in class. Better not to miss more than one a day, the headmaster stated, trying to sound weighty. Harry looked up, realizing that they were standing outside Barton's classroom. Harry merely nodded, not in the least surprised that Dumbledore was aware of any misadventures occurring in his school. Harry, Dumbledore called, just as the young man was about to cross the doorway. About Professor Barton. The headmaster paused. He twirled his beard absently for a moment. Yes, Professor? Harry asked, trying to prod the man back on track. Oh yes, it's probably nothing. Harry watched as the great wizard Albus Dumbledore swept through the hall at a slight zigzag pattern, appearing to hum a tune that sounded disturbingly like God Save the Queen. What was that about, he wondered before stepping into Barton's class. Why did people always say things like at the ill-opportune moments? Sorry folks, there seems to be a mad hatchet murderer loose on the grounds, but it's probably nothing. Just stay away from dark alleys. On an unrelated matter, our dark alleys and places suitable for a grisly death tour has just been marked half price. This way if you please. And there was Harry with his ticket already purchased. Harry shook his head. Such thoughts really weren't helping. Not to mention they didn't make sense. Entering the classroom, Harry found Lily and Alice already present. He snagged a seat behind them, setting down his bag with a thump. Defense class really wasn't something he wanted to do today. The topic matter wasn't precisely his cup of tea, and truth be told, he was much better at the practical areas of defense and dueling. Harry gazed out the window as class filled up. James entered looking rather excited. Something Harry found darkly ironic. He decided to not think about it, and he wondered what he could do to take his mind off class. What he wouldn't give to have Ron and a game of hangman at the moment. Afternoon class, Barton greeted. He was dressed in wizarding robes again, the material swirled out round his ankles as he strode into the room. A few students muttered greetings. Harry merely looked out the window. Today we will be focusing on the killing curse. Some call it the worst among the unforgivables, but that is really a matter of personal opinion. Perhaps its worst characteristic is that it can't be blocked. Thus, after we've spent a little time discussing this curse and its history, we'll move on to some elementary dodging techniques, which is really the only thing that can help you should the curse be cast in your direction. Harry found himself perking up somewhat at that. A chance to get out of his seat was fine by him. Still, as the class dragged on, Harry had a hard time keeping that same level of interest. Barton's history lesson on the killing curse was boring and pointless to Harry's mind. Did it really matter the spell was a corruption of a good spell? Barton seemed to think so. He lectured extensively on how the current killing curse had grown out of the Aramaic abracadabra, which translated as, I create as I speak, and how, as with all dark magic, it was a perversion of something good. Harry found himself dozing. After what seemed like a very long time, Barton finally pushed away from his desk he had been leaning upon. All right class, the man announced, stand up and move away from your desks. Harry got to his feet rather quickly. Some of the other students looked a bit nervous. With a gesture from his wand, Barton sent the students' desks sailing toward the back of classroom, where the desks lined up neatly. This provided even more space in T-front. With another wand wave, the ground was covered in springy mats. The students walked on them experimentally. The first aspect in correct evasion is always a high sense of spatial awareness. This can be difficult when working around multiple attackers, potential allies and space obstructions. Some people stared at Barton blankly. Harry found himself, for the first time, paying attention, but even knowing that, there are a few simple methods to dodge effectively, in such a way that you can become mobile again. I'll demonstrate some, Mr. Black, if you'd lend me a hand. Barton called Sirius up to the front of the class, not something that seemed to embarrass the young man at all. Harry listened as Barton shared some simple dodging techniques. Tips for rolling, sidestepping, ducking, all the movements aimed to not land you in a posture that would be difficult to get out of. While flashy backflips and dives looked good, an awkward landing could leave you in more trouble than you started. Sirius seemed to enjoy his role casting flashing lights at the professor. However, the man's superior physical skills seemed too much and none of Sirius's spells landed even a glancing blow. Something that disappointed him. When Barton was finished with his demonstrations, Sirius moved back to the other students a little sulkily. I once saw a man move out of the way of a stunner, and move into the path of a killing curse. Barton paused. Perhaps that should be the first lesson, recognizing the difference between situations where you need to dodge, and situations where you can block the oncoming spells. In combat situations, always ready yourself to do either, and respond correctly. Break into pairs, Barton said suddenly. The students quickly moved into groupings. Alice and Lily stood together, James and Sirius also paired up. Remus caught Harry's eye and the time traveler nodded in agreement. We are going to start with a simple exercise. One partner will attack, the other will respond. I want the attacker to fire colored lights, red and green, at their partner. Responders, you will have to react to the different colored lights appropriately. If you try to block a green, you're dead. Similarly, if you dodge a red, keep a tally of how many times. We'll play this like Muggle baseball, 3 strikes and you're out, switch roles. Barton ran through the rules quickly, leaving a few people confused. But Harry found himself rather excited. Dodging and blocking was an exercise he practiced in the room of requirement. It would be nice to try the same sort of thing, but with a live person to work against. Training dummies were all well and good, but the name did have a point. Which do you want? Remus asked. I'll respond, Harry picked selfishly, eager to get right to work. Remus nodded, all right. For a moment the werewolf didn't seem sure of how to begin. Should there be a bow involved as with dueling? Finally, with a short nod of his head, Remus lifted his wand. Harry felt a rush of energy fill him. It was nice to battle against an opponent without the threat of death involved. With a flick of his wrist, Remus cast a red light. Before he could watch Harry counter, the prefect sent a green flash as his opponent. This one he did watch slightly. Harry had responded by dropping to one knee, letting the green light arch over his shoulder. Remus waved his wand, letting loose another succession of colored flashes. The simple charm that allowed different flashing lights was very easy to cast, draining little magic from the wizard using it. Thus Remus found himself wielding his wand quicker than he normally would, trying to catch Harry off guard. Harry spun, enjoying the feeling of losing himself in the exercise. It was somewhat similar to his training, this feeling of non-existence, as if he wasn't really himself anymore, he simply existed to keep up this rhythm. The different lights were like a cue to a dance. Well, perhaps that was bad example. Harry couldn't dance, but this he could do. Remus found himself smiling somewhat while he watched Harry move. He had to admit, Harry Tempest was sort of a natural at this. Or so it seemed. The boy moved tightly. Some might say gracefully, but there was nothing really graceful about his movements. They were well timed perhaps, but there was a precision and a contained quality to it. No, it wasn't graceful. Just very sharp. He also noticed that Tempest was reacting almost perfectly every time. Despite Remus's rapid casting, he had only dodged one of the red curses. One strike, Remus thought, but landing another was proving to be difficult. Remus found himself stretching his own abilities to land a hit on the new student. Harry swept his leg back and dodged a green light that had been fired at his center mass. With the sweep of his wand he blocked a red spell that had been shot at his head. Remus was proving to be an inventive opponent. Harry moved back a hair, allowing a clever side shot to miss him by a few centimeters. Most of students were growing tired of the exercise, few were attempting seriously. One rather tall Slytherin with a cleft chin sneered that such Muggle exertions shouldn't really be a part of the curriculum for a magical school. Of course, some students had taken to Barton's training with great excitement. James and Sirius seemed to be having a marvelous time. When Sirius's was the responder, the boy even managed to pull off a rather impressive limbo-style duck to avoid one light. It wasn't terribly practical, especially considering James hit him with a green light when he swung back up, but it did look cool. Also, the pair's natural competitive streak and love of showing off made him sort of a spectacle for the bored students to watch. This attention forced the pair to even greater heights of foolery, all in attempt to elicit the smiles, laughs and cheers of their classmates. Indeed, by the time class was nearing completion, almost the entire class had gathered around the two pranksters and were cheering on one or the other. Professor Barton, however, was focused on another pair. Harry Tempest and Remus Lupin hadn't changed roles once during the game he'd started. That in itself was odd. This training exercise was actually another he'd pilfered from the Ministry's Aurora training program. And Tempest seemed to be doing quite well. "That's 3, Remus finally said, breathing somewhat heavily. Harry shrugged, "But I wasn't hit by any of the green ones. That's all that really counts." Remus seemed to think for a moment. "I suppose you're right. Ready?" Harry asked. He raised his own wand, a somewhat devious expression marking his face. Remus nodded. "Class dismissed," Barton called. Everyone seemed to look around for a moment, before glancing at the clock and realizing that class had actually been over for 5 minutes. Sirius used the distraction to hit James with a green light. "Ah, that's cheating," James complained. "Nothing's cheating," Barton said ominously. James looked a little spooked, not having been aware the professor had been listening to him. "In a real fight, nothing is cheating." The class nodded a little somberly, before shooting each other amused glances. "And Tempest," Barton called as everyone began to file out. "Detention, my office after dinner." "What?" Harry asked, his face twisted with confusion. What had he done to deserve detention? Remus, who had been with him the entire time, was equally confused. "We'll discuss that tonight," Barton said, a grim expression on his face. Harry nodded distractedly before following his classmates out. It was coming on fall and the sun was setting even earlier. Still, it wasn't what one might call shadowy when Harry walked to Professor Barton's office. The halls were somewhat golden in shade, the sun picking up a honey color to the tone of the stone. Harry would still admit that he was rather confused about why Barton wanted him in his office. Perhaps the time traveler had sort of used up Remus's time in the exercise, but Harry thought, and the prefect had agreed, that time spent trying to hit a difficult target like Harry was also a good learning experience. And he certainly hadn't broken any rules. He'd followed Barton's directions perfectly. Was it his fault that he'd done well enough to not need to switch roles? Still, a part of Harry would admit that he was a little curious about what Barton's office would look like. He'd seen that room under many masters. It had shown Lockhart's ego gratification, Remus's interest in magical creatures, Umbridge's disturbing adoration of the color pink and fudge. Although which was more disturbing was difficult to peg. So he was a little excited to open the door to Barton's room, and a little disappointed at what he found. Barton apparently liked shutters. That was all Harry could grasp from the man's nearly sterile office. No knickknacks, no mementos, no cloves of garlic strung across the wall. It didn't look lived in at all. Even the bookshelves were empty. The only thing noteworthy about the room had been the addition of some dark shades that cast the office into an almost artificial night. Harry knocked, after peeking in of course. "Professor?" he called. There was no answer. Maybe he wasn't back from dinner. That seemed unlikely. From what Harry had seen, the man rarely ate in the Great Hall, and he was always already present when Harry had come for Sirius's lessons. Still, it probably wouldn't be good to be caught snooping through his office. Harry already had one detention without obvious reason. He didn't really want one for a real transgression. Still, he stood idly in the door for a moment, not quite sure of his next step. That would prove to be an error. A sudden force seemed to latch onto him, yanking him off his feet and dragging him into the room. But the force was not so mysterious when Harry spotted a cloaked man, masked, standing inside the room, his wand out and pointed in Harry's direction. Harry tried to dig his feet into the ground, but his shoes skidded across the wood surface. His own wand was suddenly in his hand. Deciding to ignore the fact that he couldn't stop for the time being, Harry allowed the momentum to bring him closer to the masked man, bringing his wand down in a slicing gesture. He was simply too close to miss. The figure hissed in pain. It had been a simple stinging hex, but at close range it would probably leave a welt. And it had stopped whatever spell the man had been using to bring him closer. It must have been some sort of soundless summoning charm. Harry moved back a few steps, not turning his back on his opponent. He wasn't quite certain how a simple detention had devolved into a fight. Wait, what day was it? It wasn't Thursday, was it? That would explain so much. But the today's day was starting not to matter. Harry's opponent had raised his own wand. His masked face didn't express any emotion, but Harry got the sense that the man was evaluating him. With a subtle whip of the man's wand, a bunch of cord shot towards Harry. But that was one spell that Harry had experienced before. And any spell that keeps you tied to a statue while a Dark Lord is reborn, well, that tends to be the spell you learn to counter. Harry had found an effective but simple spell. Incendio, he called. The flames licked up the flying cords, burning at a magical rate. In only moments merely ash remained, falling harmlessly at Harry's feet. Defindo, a voice other than Harry's stated. Harry rolled as a severing charm curse flew at his head. He spun with a little more speed than intended and he landed on his knee, one arm bracing his body as the other held his wand steady. The man raised his wand again, but Harry had waited enough. Stupefy, he called, letting the red light arch up toward the masked man. The figure blocked it casually, but Harry was already following up with bludgeoning hex. Once upon his 4th year, he might have followed up with an Expelliarmus, his charm of choice. But he'd gradually come to the idea that just because a wizard doesn't have a wand, doesn't mean he can't hurt you. Now an unconscious wizard or a grievously wounded wizard, well, that is another kettle of fish. The wizard hadn't been expecting that curse as much and was forced to jerk sideways, the spell landing instead on an empty shelf. The hex slammed into it with the force of a hammer and the wood shattered, oddly enough making the loudest noise of the encounter. Both Harry and his masked attacker had fought with confidence, both remaining rather quiet throughout the fight. The masked man, however, paid little mind to the destruction. He used it instead, banishing the wood in Harry's direction. Harry batted him away. They weren't flung with enough force to be dangerous, but they were blocking his vision. The man seemed to have been expecting this, but rather than taking the time to use another curse, he'd gotten closer, his gloved hand coming in contact with Harry's face, slamming his fist into Harry's cheek. The pressure on his face knocked Harry back a bit, but he raised his hand to check for any bleeding and didn't find any. He steadied himself in an instant. Muggle fighting was perhaps his weakest skill. Taking a hit wasn't a problem. In his Muggle days he'd been the one being punched, not doing the punching. And training by yourself in the room of requirement can only go so far. For instance, it can't provide you with a karate master capable of teaching you the touch of death. And yes, Harry had asked. Still, he wasn't a slouch in the magic department. In fact, he had more than enough magical energy to spare. Harry fired back with a rapid release of spells, his wand moving fast. Powerful spells flowing from him as if they were nothing. A cutting curse, a suffocating charm, a complex power-weakening hex, a volley of stunners and, to finish the list, a quiet summoning charm for the man's wand. Expelliarmus was all well and good, but people tended to know what you were planning and could respond accordingly. A simple and quiet summoning charm could at times be more effective. Or so Harry speculated, but the figure seemed to have been expecting the sudden assault. He moved quickly and efficiently, dodging through the maze of light with a manner of ease. However, something had to get through. One of the stunners clipped the man's elbow, not enough to knock him unconscious, but the spell seemed to make him a little dizzy. Harry neared for a moment and the man's hand swung out in an arc, clocking him in the head and trying to knock him away. But Harry paid little attention to the blow that should have sent his ears ringing. Taking the opening, he sent another bludgeoning hex without thought. This time the man barely managed to move out of the way. Harry sent another blast, missing the man's head but hitting his shoulder with a sound that must be painful. However, the masked figure didn't make a sound. Instead, he raised his hand in a peaceful gesture, letting his wand clatter to the floor. Harry's breathing was heavy. He was ready to finish this, but he paused, summoning the man's wand to his hand. He took a step back. He didn't need another hit to recognize that his opponent enjoyed physical combat. The man didn't rise, but raised his hand to his hood, grabbing the material at the top of the head. He pulled it down to reveal a face that Harry knew. Professor Barton, he said, his voice not allowing any surprise to register. He'd been caught in reaction mode. If he'd been able to think, then it would have been obvious that his defense professor was the best candidate. After all, that post did seem to have it in for him. How many had attacked him now? But beside that, who else had known that he was going to be here? Impressive, the man said, rising to his feet. Harry took another step back. Despite what Barton may think, revealing his identity did not win Harry's trust. If anything, it had made him more weary. Your skills, Barton explained. Harry didn't speak. I'm sorry if you think this a little out of hand, Barton admitted. But after seeing you in class today, well, I had to fully understand your ability. As I say, impressive. You must have had an interesting education. Harry still wasn't drawn in by the man. He watched him carefully, keeping a good distance between him. You think it's a good idea to harm students? Harry inquired with a slight chill to his tone. No one was harmed, Barton stated. He seemed to have recognized Harry's reservation. I set up a neutrality ward. It only lasts for an hour and is beastly complicated. I'm glad this wasn't a waste of my time. No one could be hurt within the ward. He flexed his own arm to show that the forceful bludgeoning curse hadn't seemed to have left any lasting effect. Harry raised his own hand toward his cheek, noticing that his face didn't seem to ache like it should. Harry continued to show little change of emotion. Barton didn't seem to mind. I hope you know that you're going to have to choose a side, Mr. Tempest, Barton said silkily. Some may be able to cling to the fence and ignore the chaos our world is falling into. But a man with your talent won't be able to stay at the wayside. Barton turned his back on Harry and settled at his desk. You're excused, he said, not bothering to look at Harry as he spoke. Harry's grasp on Barton's wand was just as strong, and he felt an odd feeling that perhaps he shouldn't return this wand. He had no idea what the man would do with it. What good or evil would Barton do with the tool Harry held? As he stared at the back of the man's head, Harry felt an uncomfortable pressure, as if his choice might mean something. Harry dropped the man's wand to the ground before turning on his heel. Choose carefully, Barton's voice finished before Harry closed the door behind him. In the hallways again, the light was just as warm and golden. Barton's office felt like it was in another time. It was impossible to imagine that he had felt the rush of a fight only moments ago. The lack of reason behind the ATTCK left Harry feeling cold. There hadn't been a conclusion, and he was no more aware of the intentions of the masked man than he had been when the stranger had first struck. Was Professor Barton's face just another mask? Harry turned towards the Gryffindor common room, noting unpleasantly that the edges of his vision were still watching the defense professor's door cautiously. He was certain of only one thing. This bloody sand had better start working again, quick.